All right then. So today we're gonna start to uh, cover the thorax. So I'm gonna share the video. All right, it's all on. Now let's just start it. All right. So if you get the thorax note, I mean it's also there in the copy shop. It starts with the vertebrae, just a summary of the mainly thoracic vertebrae, and basically it's just from anatomy one, so we're not gonna cover them. And I also wrote about the joints of the vertebral column and the movements, and also wrote about the ribs, the sternum, and all those joints of the thoracic wall. All right. So I wrote all about these joints and everything. Well, basically you've done them last semester, so I'm not going to spend any time on it now. Let's just get to started because they already started the thorax in the practice. So I don't want to waste time on those. Also for the vertebrae and the joints, I already have videos that I recorded them like 2 years ago. So I will just send a link of it for you. Just remind me to do it. And we're all going to be good. All right. So the very first thing to start learning about the thorax, just 1 second. Please keep your microphones off so the voice will be recorded finally. Okay, so if we start with the thorax, the very first thing that we need to learn is few things that we've got to know on the surface anatomy of the body. So there are some certain lines that we need to learn in order to help us later if we are talking about any specific organs or any specific parts of the organs. We need to learn these lines. So these lines would guide us to localize some specific organs or even some specific points of the organs, all right? So the very first line that we can get to see over here in this picture is the anterior median line, or the other name is mid-sternal line. So the mid-sternal line is passing in the midline of the body anteriorly through the sternum, so divides the, let's say, thorax to the two proper halves, all right? Once we get to have the mid-sternal line, parallel with the lateral borders of the sternum, we have another line that I draw it right now, and these lines are called as parasternal lines. Okay, so we use these lines sometimes. Then, once we are running more laterally, so right medial to the nipple, we have a line that we are drawing. That line is called as mid-clavicular line. Okay, so you see from midline we started anteriorly and we are running laterally. So mid-clavicular line is done. And then if I'm running more laterally, we are actually reaching toward the axilla. So on this picture, if you see, you have a line which is drawn from the arm and it's passing parallel with the anterior axillary fold. If you remember, anterior axillary fold was formed with this guy, with the anterior inferior margin of the pec major. Okay, so that skin fold, what you see over here, is anterior axillary fold. So if you draw a line along with the anterior axillary fold, that's going to be called as anterior axillary line. Then more posteriorly and laterally, we can draw a line passing through the middle of the axilla, or let's say the apex of the axillary fossa. And this guy is going to be the mid-axillary line. And more posteriorly, you draw another line which is passing parallel with the posterior axillary fold, which was already formed by the by the latissimus dorsi and teres major muscles posteriorly. So we've got three axillary lines. So anterior, mid, and posterior axillary lines. Okay. So anterior and posterior axillary lines, they were formed by those posterior and anterior axillary folds. So posteriorly, if you look, posterior axillary fold will be somewhere here. Okay. What other lines we can find posteriorly? So we've got, again in the midline, another line which is passing through the vertebrae, and that's called as posterior median line, or the other name would be mid-vertebral line. Vertebral line. Then, along with this transverse processes of the vertebrae, again we can draw another line, which we call them as paravertebral lines. So these are just located right opposite to the midsternal and parasternal lines, okay? So over here we have the paravertebral lines. And more laterally, so basically between the posterior axillary and paravertebral lines, you can find another line, and this guy is called as scapular line. And scapular line is passing vertically through inferior angle of the scapula, okay? So these are the major lines that we need to learn about the thorax. In the actual note that you find it in the copy shop, like these ones are not there because I added them recently. So I can send a PDF of these ones or a screenshot of these pictures, but the rest is pretty much the same as here. To start with the thorax, so we can get to see the thoracic cage, which is formed by the ribs, by the sternum, and even posteriorly the ribs, we know that it's already connected with the vertebrae. And then, so thoracic cage is basically forming the borders of the thoracic cavity, which is located between them all. So in order to enter the thoracic cavity, we have the superior thoracic aperture or thoracic inlet, even you can call it, which is bordered by T1 vertebra posteriorly, the first pairs of the ribs and their costal cartilage, and the superior border of the manubrium of the sternum. Okay, so these guys are the borders of the thoracic inlet. So thoracic inlet makes the connection between the thoracic cavity and the neck and the, let's say, upper limbs. So basically all those structures like trachea, esophagus, which we learned about them all in the head and neck. Let's say the arteries which are meant to go toward the head and neck, or the upper limbs, or the veins which are coming backward, and the lymphatics. So they are all passing through the superior thoracic aperture. Then from the other side, inferiorly, you have the inferior thoracic aperture, all right, which in our body it's closed off by the diaphragm. So inferior thoracic aperture is bordered by 12th thoracic vertebra, then 11 and 12 ribs, more posteriorly and laterally, and then anterolaterally you have the costal margin forming the border, and then at last, anteriorly, you have the joint between the body of the sternum and the xiphoid process. So the joint is called as xiphisternal joint. So this is the anterior border of the inferior thoracic aperture. All right. So these are just theories. Most probably they're not going to ask you. So just to show you over here, a fine picture of the inferior thoracic aperture. So if I add up the connective tissue, so we get to have all the, let's say, structures that we need. So then over here,
Sir, we can't see you. Oh, his iPad went off.